Hello.
Our story begins as a rebel vessel catapults between a Star Destroyer and two of her support ships. The cruiser's afterburners bursted forward as the captain yelled out orders for everyone to hold on. Just behind him, the Princess of Alderaan gripped a handlebar right by the doorway. The 17-year-old princess and those around her were lifted off of the ground as the ship barreled over an acquaintance and under another in its path, before the captain toggled the hyperdrive with what he believed were the right coordinates, before forcing the hyperdrive sticks in and launching the ship out of the system. The captain sighed heavily, having spotted an interdictor arriving at a hyperspace to trap them before they escaped. He turned around and told the young princess that she needed to stop being here for these missions, her eyebrows raised in a perplexed manner, reminding him that she got them off the planet before they got captured on the planet. She did her job, he did his. They should keep it that way. He nodded his head, and they went their separate ways. Leia had to assess the cargo and make sure it was alright. R2 and her clocked that it was, and then moved on from there. When they arrived, they realized they weren't where they were supposed to go. The plan was initially to drop out of hyperspace over the hidden base at Crate, drop some supplies, and then return to Naboo where they would be dropping some more supplies for the rest of the rebels. Leia and her family were funding rebel movements on the Chancellor's home world, or Emperor now, and it was going well, until they ended up where they were at the moment. The captain had no clue, and the system didn't appear on any modern star charts. They scanned nearby and didn't recognize any of the celestial bodies in this area of the galaxy. Luckily, they weren't super concerned because their ship had enough juice to get them to a refueling depot, but still, something was awry here. Leia walked to the front of the vessel and asked for a status, and looked to her surroundings. She didn't even ask as the ship moved forward. One of the gunners called out, addressing a large structure in this area. While the Death Star hadn't yet become a concern of the Alliance, there were still rumors of a superstation being built by the Empire. If that was a reality, then it most certainly could be right here. The captain had a bad gut feeling, and told the crew to turn their ship around, but Leia, again, in her youthful stubbornness, directed them to continue forward. Something here was worth finding, and abandoning the star system wouldn't lead them to anything aside from more questions. They needed to see what it was. Perhaps it could be something useful for their cause. The pilot's shoulders tensed, and he relayed Leia's command. The ship slowly rolled around a celestial body, of what they didn't know was a burned-out star. It was a lifeless husk, something that sounded like Sith legends or something worse. Eventually, the ship got around the massive object and came before a towering structure, ancient by the looks of it. The cabin released a sigh of relief, just knowing that they hadn't discovered an Imperial outpost or something worse. But they had more questions, just as Leia suggested they would if they left. Anyways, the afterburners continued pushing them forward until they got to the superstructure and docked at the outside. A couple of troopers using mech-neck suits abandoned the light vessel and entered the massive space station. Within minutes, they were able to detect that the air was breathable, but stale as hell. Leia didn't care. She prepped her pistol and told R2 to come along, and he chirped happily as he followed. They entered the massive structure, about 20 men from the crew joining the princess, as the command deck remained inside the cruiser, waiting for their return. It would take hours to scale the massive structure. Its power was pretty much disabled from the looks of things, but whoever last manned it seemed to have maintained the oxygen levels, in hopes that someone might find them or maybe something more sinister. When they eventually reached the control room, they powered it up, using levers. Leia was surprised that R2 wasn't needed, but she patted her droid anyways, for sticking with them during this ascent. The generator on the massive structure boomed open, cranking its gears and shouting out terrible screeches and twists. Eventually, though, it stopped, and the rebels were able to start accessorizing their new toy. But then the dilemma came, when they realized what this was. Per R2's translation of the ancient script, the space station they sat within was called the Star Harvester, or just Starforge for short. This vessel could destroy an entire celestial body to claim its energy. From it, any number of things could be created. A single wish was its command, and it continued to supply wishes as long as energy was given back. Those present inside the command center were concerned greatly with the power held within this ship. Some of the rebels thought about the tectonic shift this type of weapon could give them. They no longer would be rebels. They would be equal on footing with the Imperial regime that had more than 20 years of preparation, if you want to include the Clone Wars in that as well. Leia was obviously on edge about the entire thing, but she had R2 take a hold of the schematics of this monstrosity, so that she could report it back to Mon Mothma and her own father, Bail Organa. However, the Princess of Alderaan had no intentions of returning to the rebel base. She reasoned that someone needed to stay behind, which she volunteered for. R2 would deliver the blueprints to the cruiser they arrived in, before joining her back inside the command room. The strategy would quickly come together, and by the end of the hour, every technician and pilot from the cruiser would join Leia in the command center to accessorize his vessel, while the cruiser delivered the information to the Alliance leaders before completing the supply run. Leia and her crew would remain at the Star Forge for hours, spending every waking moment learning something new about the impossibly large space station. As they realized, this machine had died breathing in the life of a now dead star, meaning that this weapon could produce anything they wanted at this given moment. Thanks to R2 carrying around some other schematics, they were able to implant designs of a B-wing starfighter, and out popped the ship. It was hoisted into the hangar bay because there were no automatic pilots inside of it. Producing the B-wing helped them learn that instead of just creating warships that didn't have the pilots to operate them, they could create an automated army or navy. But Leia, the highly educated daughter of the Queen of Alderaan, knew that an automated military would remind the people of the Empire of the Separatist crisis that plagued the galaxy before her birth. If the Alliance wanted to stand a chance, they needed to remain a fighting force on the ground, but they could most certainly attempt some things in the air. Leia suggested that they implant holograms onto the droid pilots, so that if Imperials caught a glimpse of them, they'd never think anything other than what they currently had, sentient pilots. This was a great idea, and with some big brain work from R2, they were able to do it. The second B-wing was created as was requested. An automated ship was also brought into the hangar bay for them to investigate. The group would accessorize the ships and test them out. The schematics, flying habits, tugs or pulls, speed, firepower, and everything were exactly the same. Both B-wings were exact replicas of the ship stolen by General Syndulla's Ghost Squad earlier this year. It was incredible just knowing that this could create something so similar to what was already made by human hands. Leia and her crew continued poking around with it, learning that they could create pretty much anything they wanted, but instead of doing it, they would occupy the command center at the tip-top of the space station and discuss some potential ship designs and valuable assets that could assist the Alliance. Leia, in essence, wanted to have an entire board of strategic maneuvers that could assist them when the time came for Bail and Mon to see the space station. The rebels would spend a solid 4 days by themselves at the Star Forge, before they received a proximity alert. The blaring alarms inside the station sent everyone into a frenzy, but the sight of an Alderaanian fleet brought them comfort. Fresh food, Alliance leaders, and a couple of strategists arrived as well. Among them were Captain Andor, General Syndulla, and Captain Rex. These rebels were eager to see the station, but none of them could believe what they were seeing by the time they actually saw it for the first time. Thanks to Leia's decision to stay behind, they had prepared a number of potential calculations and strategies that could assist them with taking the fight to the Empire. It wouldn't be easy given their limited energy, but they could always risk their integrity by destroying another star to compete with the Empire. See, with these calculations were several ideas. They could mass-produce an automatic hit-and-run fleet, which would be useful at smashing through Imperial defenses, or simply put, continuing their current strategy just on a much larger scale. They could also build a true competitor of a fleet, using their sentient leadership to outmaneuver and prepare for Imperial forces. Or, of course, they could produce a superstar cruiser and hope that it had good enough shields and firepower to absolutely shatter opposition fleets. Perhaps there were other alternatives, but this is what the 17-year-old princess and her team came up with. Though Bail and Mon were almost on edge about doing this, like they feared that by using the Forge, they'd be damning themselves to eternity. It left the usual, respectful Leia pissed off. This was a fight that she was forced to bear because these presumptuous jackasses couldn't stop Palpatine from rising, and now she had to sit back because they didn't think it was worth their honor to use this weapon? She apologized and then stammered back forward, calling out Alliance leaders for their cowardice. The people of the galaxy were counting on them, and what now? They were going to have to wait because honor is shared one way but not the other? The Empire oppressed because it could. It didn't care about who did it morally or proudly. They did what they wanted because that's what their emperor did. That's what their mothers and fathers did. She wouldn't stand for it, and she started to see why Guerrera stood so firmly opposed to the alliance. Cassian interjected, suggesting that Leia had a good point, and this was supported by both General Dodonna and General Syndulla. Mon and Bail saw the changing of the guard before them and realized that their initial stance had been wrong. They couldn't be wasting time bickering over moral dilemmas while people starved on the streets of Ecumenopolis across the core. Slavery still existed, both literal and figurative. This was their chance to use machines to do the heavy lifting while they united a society under one banner. These discussions bounced around before they came to a resolution. The Alliance would multiply their hit-and-run resources 10,000-fold. By using the Star Forge, they would expand upon R2's rough schematics for the B-Wings, including other flagship models of the Alliance. By doing this, they could avoid detection from Imperial machines. The Empire would change their approach if they used larger ships. Many of their own vessels were being protected at Chopper Base anyways, so there was no need to dedicate more resources to hiding a much larger fleet. If the rebels utilized a much larger fleet, full of larger vessels, then the Empire could keep track of them. Many Imperial movements were created to mimic rebel strikes. But if they came from everywhere, then what could the Empire do? Plus, the torpedoes from X-Wings, Y-Wings, and B-Wings could absolutely cripple Imperial fleets. This became the main focus. Cassian suggested that if they plaster Imperial destroyers and their shields, then they could become easy targets for anyone, not just rebels. Though Leia had another question, after catching Ezra's eye from the other side of the room. She asked if they could perhaps continue to use this weapon. If they had it loaded up and ready to go, they could be prepared to counter with something else. The rebels around the room broke out into a murmur. Leia watched Ezra lean in to say something inaudible to Kanan, which got a reaction from Hera. The Jedi didn't believe killing a son was right, but the Boken Jedi, Ezra, believed that it could strategically assist their fight. It was the cost of one life over thousands, or millions, or billions, or trillions. Kanan recited the attachment rule, which suggested if a Jedi had an attachment, then they could be hurting others by having it. The Alliance and traditional Jedi values might search to protect the star, but it was the needs of the many over the needs of the few. They, as Jedi, should support the use of this weapon, as should the other Alliance leaders. Kanan believed that they were fearful of becoming like the Empire, which is what Hera believed was the Alliance's fear too. Leia looked at them, prompting Syndulla to reflect on their conversation for the rest of the class. Everyone took in the suggestion Syndulla and her team made. To sacrifice a lone star was worth it, because the future could not be held in reserve of moral complacency. Too much time had been squandered. Billions had died. The time now was to act. So the Alliance agreed that once the massive fighter fleet was completed, they would locate a solo star and drain it of all of its energy, so that they could prepare for whatever came next. As a precaution, they would slowly churn out these fighters, as to not alert the Empire with an energy burst. It worked, even though, had they done the full batch at the same time, they wouldn't have alerted anyone. When the batch was finished, after a few weeks of production, the fleet would be deposited around the galaxy to various rebel leaders. A major force was dedicated to Atalon, with multiple others sent to Hoth, Agen Kloss, Crate, Dantooine, Dakar, and the home base, Yavin 4. The exact count of starfighters was unknown. It ranged well above 1 million. They were divided pretty evenly, meaning that there were several hundred thousands of X-Wings, B-Wings, and Y-Wings. Just for good measure, a couple thousand A-Wings were put into production to make it seem like it was a legitimate move by the rebels. Because they had so many forces under their control now, actual rebel pilots were given more command. This only went to squad leads, while the rest of their squads brought up the rear. So for Blue or Red Squadron of Yavin, they'd lead a group of fighters to an Imperial base and let the automated droids do the dirty work for them. Same one for individuals like General Syndulla. The next month or so would have hit and runs rise across the galaxy. The Imperial machine was consistently perplexed by these attacks, and they had no counter. When the rebels dropped out of hyperspace with a couple dozen ships, it was no big deal, but this was a swarm. It was comparable to the days of the Clone Wars, except Imperial pilots weren't nearly as trained and TIE fighters weren't nearly as armored or protected, so these small skirmishes were bloodbaths for the Empire. Whether it be a Star Destroyer or a shipyard, it didn't matter. Everything was clobbered into near oblivion. Fighters rained out of hyperspace and bombarded the surface cannons before shredding through shield generators. Ironically, because of how much damage a single swarm could do, they'd accidentally, but not regretfully, claim kills on Imperial warships. They weren't prepared, and their fighter defense was quickly wiped out whenever they tried to counter. These assaults were referred to by the Empire as swarms, and it gave the rebellion a sort of ammunition against the Imperial machine. They finally had their own little devices of terror to use against the Empire, and they couldn't do anything against it. Palpatine and other top Imperial strategists knew that something was off, but they didn't know what. To everyone else, it looked like the rebellion had amassed thousands of fighter pilots and fighters to supply them with. The Sith Lord quietly believed that ancient tech was at play here, but he was unsure because not a single soul had reported these rebel fighters to be anything but people. No pilot saw any droids piloting them, so they assumed that the rebels had more to offer than not. So a lot of these briefings revolved around finding out the supplier of these rebel starships and where these pilots were being recruited from. To the Empire, it was clear they had missed something, but there wasn't anything they missed. The rebels didn't suddenly amass hundreds of thousands of pilots or starships. That was a fever dream. The natural reaction, because Ancient Space Station wasn't on their list of possibilities, was to send scouts out into the known galaxy to target locations that could be rebel bases. In the meantime, though, Leia and Ezra were teamed up together to assist in the destruction of another star. This was a hard but necessary choice. Hera noted that the two of them were playing eye tag at the last event, which Bridger shook off with a blushing face. She knew what that meant, and told him to go and spend some time with the princess. It'd be great for the two of them. Ezra had the luxury of being around Sabine, whom he considered a sister, and Zeb, who acted like a brother. Leia, on the other hand, didn't have that, and Hera knew that. This would be good for the two of them, which it really was, and it led to them having some very deep conversations about ethics and morals, and destroying stars. Though there was something quite beautiful about being alone together in front of a star's final sunset. Across the galaxy, Imperial facilities kept getting leveled. This gave way for more people to become rebels because the Alliance was proving how effective they were at their jobs of fighting the Empire. Though this resulted in some minor changes. Lothal had been hit once or twice, and finally, Grand Admiral Thrawn and the 7th Fleet were pulled from the star system. Sidious knew that if he wanted to have success against the Swarm, then he needed someone like Thrawn, not a Krennic, not a Tarkin. The Chiss Admiral reported some weaknesses within the Swarm, but there was no greater flaw for their own defense than the Imperial TIE Fighter. Most who spoke to Palpatine knew to compliment him and praise him, but Thrawn didn't play those games. He simply ignored those pleasantries and gave his Emperor a clear and defined plan. If they wanted to stop the Swarm, then all credits going to Krennic Stardust needed to stop, and the TIE Defender program needed to become the central focus of the Imperial machine. Palpatine listened and obliged his Admiral's concerns and readjustments. It was important to readily change himself in order to maintain control over his empire. Even though the rebels hadn't conquered any territory, they left Imperial defenses crippled. Anyone could attack, which is what happened, so they needed to rally behind something. If they didn't, then they were jeopardizing their own future. Luckily for the Empire, the rebels hadn't gotten super deep into the core. Their swarms were crushing through inner rim and mid-rim territories and moving quickly. Tests were immediately put into place, and within mere days, the first TIE Defender started construction on Corellia, Kuat, and Ringo Vinda. It was a terribly important build, especially with the rebels closing in so quickly and confidently. Outside of the Imperial machine in the core, the Starforge was ready to go yet again. The rebels were pushing closer and closer towards potentially trying to win this conflict, but hesitancy started to rise. Ghost Crew, including Ezra, returned to Lothal. They would be heralded as liberators, which would earn them respect from the home world of Ezra and her neighboring systems. The Alliance was looking strong, and the pullback from the Empire made bright minds within the rebel movement nervous. Dodonna, Soto, Syndulla, Leia, and Rex were the most concerned out of anyone else. The Alliance figureheads were worried, but not nearly as much. Their optimism blinded them to the reality of what they faced, because Mothma and Organa still listened in on the Senate sessions, and they believed that any motion for the Empire would come from the body. Either it was naivety or plain stupidity, no one really knew, but for Leia specifically, she was getting irritated with the inaction from both of them. Instead of waiting for permission from her father, she'd gather together Alliance warriors, these being generals and commanders, people that actually fought the battles, not whined about them in debriefings, all together. The swarm had been successful, all around the board, had a catchy name. It was feared by Imperials and championed by rebels. They needed to consider the future of the rebel innovation though. She put it to a vote to see if they wanted to use a super vessel or create an actual Alliance fleet. Surprisingly, the rebels decided on a super battle cruiser or battleship. They would do this by using old specs for former Republic superstar dreadnoughts, like the Pride of the Corps. These were vessels that either got off the assembly line or didn't. Honestly, it didn't really matter because they weren't in use now. What did though was what they could and would be used for. The rebels planned on utilizing these blueprints to create themselves a super battleship. It was outfitted with various specs, combined together with the best engineers on this side of the galaxy, and worked out to fit the needs of the rebels. While it would have a fully automated crew, there would be quarters, barracks, and mess halls and so forth for the rebels if they wanted to or needed to control the ship for themselves. Eventually, word of this rebellion, led by Leia, reached the Alliance on Yavin, which sent its leaders into a tailspin. They were pissed off, none more than Bail Organa, because his daughter had gone behind his back. But she, like many others, realized that the fight needed to happen now. This bickering back and forth, trying to manage the perfect strategy, would never amass to completing their goals. Mon and Bail were waiting for a signal from the Senate, which never would come, and Leia's rebels knew that the Empire was working on a counter, so they had to do something. Revolution isn't perfection. Rebellion isn't built on marble. Its ideals are as immortal as the hope that drives them. Leia recognized that before her father did, and now he was forced to make amends with an old friend from the past. Bail, fearful of a divide that could come from his daughter's actions, called upon Ben Kenobi for help. The old hermit didn't want to return to the fight, so Bail went to Tatooine. It started much like their conversation from 7 years before. This time, it would result in Bail going to Owen and Beru to buy them out. Luke was needed, just in case his sister went too far, fearing that she would become like Saw Gerrera, and Bail could afford to get Owen and Beru some land on Alderaan, which they rejected, so instead they got cheap labor. Eventually, as a side note, this cheap labor would betray them and kill them in their sleep. Until then, though, Luke and Ben were off on their first grand adventure, which included waiting inside the hangar bays of Yavin 4. So much fun. Bail and Leia had a reunion prior to the completion of the ship they were calling Rebel 1. This ship was a super battle cruiser, and it was named after an Alliance captain who had commanded a retrofitted Providence-class destroyer. Captain Shack was a legend around these parts. Not everyone knew him, but the rebels certainly believed that calling the new pride of the Alliance fleet after his beloved Providence would be an honor in their ranks, and it was. Father and daughter inside the Star Forge spoke for hours. It started with a slight bickering before Leia apologized for overstepping. She traditionally hadn't done this with Bail, but the Star Forge gripped her like an addiction. Leia knew how important this fight was, and she had seen what the Liberation had done to the Republic. She refused to allow that to happen to the Alliance. She didn't think she was going as far as Saw Gerrera, and in all respect, she wasn't. For Bail, it was semi-rewarding hearing his daughter say this, because if Leia was his blood, she likely wouldn't have had this fire. A fire like hers came from a mother like Padme, and a stubbornness like Leia's only came from a father like Skywalker. Leia truly was their daughter, not his, and sometimes he forgot that. There was no animosity, just a long hug, in front of the viewport that overlooked a Death Star on one side and Rebel 1 on the other. With Thrawn operating control over the Imperial defense of the core, the Empire actually started to defend themselves. These weren't perfect victories, but they were something, which was more than what they had before. Thrawn restarted the Imperial defense by laying traps for these rebel fighters, which helped the Grand Admiral figure something out. These weren't sentient pilots, because some of their movements weren't natural reactions. It provided him with ample time to prepare the TIE Defender and ship them out to various frontline planets. News of Thrawn's successful defenses reached rebel lines, and his fleet became the next focus of a targeted attack. Unluckily for the rebels, General Syndulla would not be leading this attack. When the rebels jumped from hyperspace, they were engaged by an intense system of defense lines. These included EMP traps, which disrupted the scanners for the self-operated vessels, and showed off who was commanding and who was mindlessly following orders. In other words, who was sentient and who was not. Thrawn then told his TIE defenders which ships to target, and they did. Within 30 minutes of arriving, the entire sentient pilot force would be wiped out. The defenders did lose some pilots, either kamikaze or proper torpedo shots, but not enough for Thrawn to be concerned. As he had anticipated, the automatic pilots split into every which direction. Initially, it was a triumphant moment, but then he realized that the rebels had a plan created for this kind of situation, devised by Cassian Andor. All the automated ships dispersed into a frenzy. Some of them clobbered into TIE defenders, others into the 2 interdictors Thrawn brought in to stop the rebels from escaping. They even flew into undefended Star Destroyers, crushing their bridges. Thrawn scoffed, watching Admiral Constantine detonate, like a mustached fool. Though it was not the end of the battle. The Chimera was riddled by explosives, luckily not detonating in the process. The bombardment of kamikaze rebel fighters would persist for another 10 agonizing minutes, until the Imperial fleet would properly claim victory over the swarm for the first time ever. But for Thrawn, this triumph wouldn't last that long. The rebels, with knowledge of this defeat, readied a new fleet for combat. With it were 30,000 fighters and Rebel 1. As for the Starforge, it was being relocated by General Dodonna. Unknown to the rebels, Lord Vader was trying to chase it down. Unsuccessfully, I might add. The rebel fleet, massive in size, departed for Thrawn's location. The Imperials at this core frontline system were licking their wounds badly. They had been devastated by the previous attack, but they had proven that the TIE defenders were a worthwhile production. A fully detailed report was sent back to the Emperor by Thrawn, before the new fleet arrived at a hyperspace. When Thrawn reached the bridge to oversee repairs, another proximity alert bursted through the bridge. Thrawn assumed more fighters, and then he was met with a true battleship. Without the Executor-class Superstar Dreadnought being completed yet, this was the biggest ship ever seen by Thrawn. It outclassed the Malevolence in firepower, shielding, and in size. And unluckily for the Empire, General Grievous was not its bumbling captain. The rebels didn't even wait, as the heavy turbo lasers shredded through every single carrier in the fleet. The TIE defenders didn't even have a chance to get off the ground to defend themselves, and Thrawn called out orders as he watched already badly damaged Star Destroyers rip apart. Even if it hadn't been for the previous attack a few hours before, Rebel 1 would have had very little problem dissecting the Imperial fleet. The damage from the previous attack crippled every Star Destroyer's shields, and now they were helpless. In a manner similar to the Malevolence, Rebel 1 bared down on her opponents and shredded every single one of them. Fighters split down various avenues to deter the TIE bombers from making a move on the Pride of the Alliance. Cannons poured across the darkness of space, lighting up flickers of hope. The end of the Empire would come, and the rebels would be that anger. Thrawn, stationed on his bridge, sat still, knowing that there would be no point in running. The Grand Admiral welcomed his demise, petting his beloved Chimera one last time, as any good captain would. His crew and terror ran in every which direction, but not even their panic could disrupt one final peaceful moment with his beloved Star Destroyer. The explosion of the ship would mark the end of the 7th Fleet, and give way for the Alliance to once again retreat and hit and run. Yet, despite these positive results, and those seen with Ghost Crew on Lothal, there were growing fears in the galaxy. The Alliance was a symbol of hope, but what happens when that symbol becomes bigger than just a rebellion? These weren't just little raids anymore. The Swarm was a ravenous beast, and because no one knew about Rebel 1 due to no survivors from the previous battle, the Swarm seemed like an unbeatable opponent. Hope did exist, but people started to fear the Alliance because if they could amass this type of power, then surely they could oppress just as much as the Empire did. Think pieces pushed by Palpatine came out. These were in all actuality potential contingency plans that he had rejected. Palpatine used these to fuel fear into the populace once he read the room. Some of these were torturous games to torment little kids from neighboring systems within the Empire. Others were slave rings, or perhaps even more fun, slaughterhouses for opposition forces. None of these were rebel intentions, because they came out of Palpatine's sick handlers. Even though these contingencies wouldn't see the light of day, they would inspire the people to stick by the Empire and remain loyal to them and cheer for them. It's for this reason that Bail and Mon wanted to make patient and calculated strikes based on Senate reactions. Now with the Imperial machine seizing every opportunity to vilify the Alliance, the rebels needed to make themselves more appealing. Though they didn't exactly have a means of doing that unless, after all, they didn't. Bail, Leia, and Mon Mothma would concoct a recipe to turn the hearts of the galaxy into molding around a moisture farmer from Tatooine with a dream. Sadly for Luke, it meant that Jedi training would take a backseat, but he would become a character for the rebel propaganda. He was just a kid. No one knew of him. He had a catchy name, and he looked like someone with earnest positions. Luke was a blessing in the rebel ranks, because unlike his peers, some of which his own age, he hadn't been poisoned by the sight of death. He never fought battles, never truly encountered a stormtrooper. He was a reminder of the innocence of which the Alliance started with. What the Empire had done to their fighters was a result of oppression. Luke could be the sunlight of a dying heart. There was also one other individual to add to this though, an Imperial scientist's daughter, on the run from both the Alliance and the Empire. She was all over posters because the Empire was convinced she was captured by the rebels. In reality, this little game of cat and mouse for Jyn Erso existed because she had several pseudonyms, which confused Imperial databases. Slowly, rebel propaganda artists would fixate on Jyn Erso and use Luke to get to her. By the time one BBY rolled around, he'd join other older rebels to break her free from an Imperial labor camp, all of it being recorded for the cameras, proving that 1, the Alliance hadn't actually captured her, that 2, the Imperials imprisoned their own, and that 3, the rebels were still the good guys. Jyn was important because of her father. No one knew how important Luke was because of his. But Vader, still loosely tracking a disappearing relic, returned to the galaxy when he heard of a boy named Skywalker, making a change in the hearts of Imperial citizens. See, despite Jyn and Luke being total rebels to the system, and absolutely hating the Empire, the rebels utilized their positions for their propaganda. Jyn was an Imperial officer's daughter, and Luke was a moisture farmer from Tatooine. They had nothing similar in common, but they did find each other, and they did get along. The message was that, without the Empire, 2 people from 2 completely different backgrounds could become friends, or even star-crossed lovers. And because both young adults were attractive, it promised a better future for the youth of the galaxy. It was certainly a risky plan, but it turned some heads, and it kept people's focus away from the Swarm. All of the media attention for the Swarm turned from inspiring hope to bad publicity. So the rebels created this fake little love or friendship story to keep people preoccupied. It kind of worked, but there was still a problem lurking for the rebels, and it wasn't people fearing them. The TIE Defenders, thanks to Palpatine, were equipped with beamers, as they were being labeled. Thanks to the surplus of kyber crystals for the Death Star, the Empire created mini cannons on the TIE Defenders. It meant that TIE Defenders needed tons of power to even get them off the ground, but it made the smaller and faster ship more efficient than the B-Wing with its super cannon. The issue is, the TIE Defender was now a target for the rebels. They now knew how to hit them, and hit them fast. The key was a grape shot torpedo, and thanks to the Star Forge, it was really easy to develop and disperse into the rebel fighter fleet. These grape shot torpedoes were meant to target and hit the TIE Defender. Upon collision, it would disperse, launching durasteel shrapnel into the hull of the Defender, damaging it or even destroying it, which would save more rebel lives or automated pilots. Thrawn's report helped the Empire zero in on their actual targets, the sentient pilots. So rebel strategies evolved, and the Alliance still couldn't get to the deep core. Though thanks to the use of Rebel 1, Imperial troopers were forced into their corners. The Empire, having taken so many resources away from the Death Star, were forced to look for another counter, aside from the TIE Defenders. But realistically, there wasn't anything they could use. The rebels, once they learned of these beamers, avoided using Rebel 1, unless they assertively knew they could protect it. The worst part is, they knew they couldn't, and they also knew that they could rebuild it if they needed to. But unlike the Imperial machine, the rebels were still used to their fight-or-flight mindset, not the fact that they could overpower the Imperials if they wanted. This conservative approach saved the rebels heartache, and it also stalled some over-the-top propaganda from the Empire, because the hate they spewed at the non-existent Swarm went nowhere. What started as an impossibly large foe, the Swarm, became a battle of time. But because Sidious knew that the rebellion would cave to pain, he made efforts to hurt people for their actions against the Empire. Thousands of people would be tortured for being sympathizers. If they were or weren't, he didn't care. They were tools for his machine. The point being, they were going to lure the rebellion in, as Vader was given permission to search for his son. Honestly, for the apprentice, it was getting tiresome. He was constantly chasing after something. For months, it was a star forge. Now it was his son, and honestly, it was getting under his skin. Because he thought the son of Anakin Skywalker was dead, but Vader promised to himself to find the boy, turn him to the dark side, and kill his master. As Vader started for his second search, the Alliance struck again. Unlike their previous attacks, they made themselves known at the heart of the galaxy. The rebels usually hit perimeter planets and then ran, but here they used the route acquired by Dooku to hit Coruscant directly. 50,000 fighters deployed, blitzing the Imperial fleet. The rebels were spread out across the battlefield, while actual pilots like General Syndulla kept themselves away. They were the key to this assault, and all these automated pilots were reliant on the sentient pilots. The massive Imperial fleet moved to counter, and despite the TIE defenders getting their beamer upgrades, they were unable to defend themselves from the swarms. The Star Forge had produced a number of A-wing variants, which unloaded these shrapnel torpedoes, disabling dozens of TIEs in the process. The firefight was intense, with the rebels cruising over Star Destroyers and targeting their shields. The people of the surface couldn't believe what they were seeing, as the skies above the capital erupted into fire. Rebel pilots present at the battle kept their distance and watched TIE defenders utilize their beamers, some of them successfully cutting through what appeared to be hundreds of rebel fighters at a time. Other TIEs weren't so successful, because some of them accidentally cut through their own destroyers, causing ripples within the defense line. As the battle continued to go continuously worse for the Empire, they deployed their interdictors, hoping to destabilize the rebel reinforcements or potential retreat. Though in doing this, they sabotaged their own reinforcements, who were led to the trap by the rebels. From behind, the sentient pilots dropped the massive Kuat fleet, equipped with dozens of Star Destroyers fresh for battle, and of course, a number of TIE defenders ready to eject. At the same time, on Yavin, Vader landed his ship. He had seen the skyline during one of the rebel propaganda videos and recognized the star system. In the evening, he marched across the rebel base, killing off the few unlucky guards who got in his way, before he broke into the base. This alerted Ezra, who was up, speaking to Leia. They were at the command table, watching the event at Coruscant play live, with various advisors when the breathing was heard. Bridger ignited his emerald saber, and the 18-year-old Jedi challenged Vader, this time much more prepared than he was on Malachor. The clashing of lightsabers alerted the base to this presence. Ezra obviously wouldn't outclass Darth in a fight, but it could firstly piss him off, and secondly, stall until someone like Kanan or Kenobi joined him, which both would. The Elder and the Blind Man showed up, wielding their sabers and preparing for combat. Being that Vader remembered fighting Kenobi nearly 9 years before, he was a little worried about taking his opponent for granted. Their weapons ignited, and they moved in. Obi-Wan was much slower, but he was still efficient with the blade, having used it many times prior to coming to Yavin. Their blades connected, and Vader played defensively to stop his master from using Form 4 against him like he did after Mustafar. Kanan and Ezra continued to use their usefulness and their experience with the monster against him. The two young Jedi had asked Obi-Wan about Vader, and he had given them examples of how he defeated him twice, but it all came with knowing the opponent. Obi-Wan understood what Anakin Skywalker was, and his impatience, and his fury. This Vader was the most well-rounded version of himself, and unlike any other scenario, Ben wasn't fighting to stall. He was defending this base from potential Imperial discovery. Leia was already beginning the evacuation as it was, so the three Jedi stalled the Sith Lord. Over the capital, the new Imperial fleet from Kuat was backed up by two more, one from Hazian Prime and the other from Corellia. They rocked into the battle, chasing down the swarm, hoping to disarm his head, but General Syndulla, Agent Kallus, Captain Rex, Chopper, Zeb, and Sabine inside the Ghost were impossible to stop, even with the beamers on the defenders. The rebel fighting force was getting clobbered, but every time a starfighter was destroyed, it felt like another 5 multiplied. There's a reason they came here with 50,000 fighters, because while they were fighting, and it became clear the Empire would dedicate their resources to defending the capital, another 20 or so planets were hit with different swarm attacks. As the rebel bombers started cratering the shields on the newly arriving Star Destroyers, Syndulla issued the command that deployed Rebel 1. The massive super battleship dropped out of hyperspace and launched its attack against the multitude of Imperial vessels present. Rebel 1 was not deployed until all the interdictors were destroyed. A majority of these ships didn't have shields when Rebel 1 arrived, and they were targeted first. The cannons on the Pride of the Alliance shredded through the hulls of each undefended Star Destroyer. The Imperials cried out in terror as ship after ship detonated. Rebel 1 pushed forward, through the rubble, crushing and tearing through every Imperial vessel. Its power was undeniable, and the Rebel fighters maintained their defense of the ship. Unluckily for the Alliance, a couple defenders got through and shredded pieces of the hull. The super cannon did extreme damage to the surface of Rebel 1, but not enough to stop the ship from continuing forward. The Rebel fighters were eventually able to break the defenses, giving them a chance to break into the atmosphere, where Palpatine would be ready. The turbo towers on the surface wouldn't be enough to defend Coruscant from the swarm, and so Palpatine prepared to expose himself. Wait, not like that. Outside the atmosphere, Rebel 1 finished off the remaining destroyers, and just in time too, because another fleet deployed from hyperspace. Hera, Syndulla, and a batch of around 6,000 starfighters moved to intercept, as Blue Squadron led the remaining 17,000 fighters towards the surface of Coruscant. A lightsaber collided against the wall. Ezra held his own before his face as Vader dragged his weapon across the wall, forcing Ezra to duck out of the way. Kanan leapt up, cutting down and rolling out of his own way. By the entrance that the rebels were fleeing from, Leia watched her friends fight this monster and became furious. Wanting to help, she prepared to do something stupid. Ben and Vader connected. The Dark Lord swung aggressively down, slashing his blade across the entire chamber as Kenobi ducked out of the way. The old man's powers had been weaker, but Vader was still wary as he sidestepped Ezra, who rolled across the ground and lobbed his saber through a pillar and pulled it towards him with the Force. It fell on top of Vader. Bridger pulled his pistol and fired it at the Sith Lord, while running around the room and grabbing a saber with the Force. Vader crushed through the pillar while defending himself, showing weaknesses in his armor but not stopping. Kanan took the first brutal hit, falling backwards as Kenobi stepped in, blocking and defending Jarrus' life. As their blades continued, Vader told his old master that he wouldn't keep his son hidden forever. Obi-Wan smirked, holding the saber above his head and telling Vader that he couldn't get a grip on his own daughter, let alone his own son. A puzzled expression wrote itself across the inside of his mask, as an electrical burst was shot across Vader's back. He wheezed in pain as he was electrocuted by his daughter, but Leia let out some of her father's rage, as she fired the shocker at least 15 more times. Vader was in an agonizing pain, and he was unable to do anything about it, because his entire suit was shut down. Ezra had to stop her, but she wasn't satisfied. Vader needed to pay for all the people he killed. If this was her reaction without the Death Star, imagine what it would have been with it. Anyways, she pecked Ezra on the cheek and abandoned the room, per Obi-Wan's request. They had captured a Sith Lord. Over the cities of Coruscant flew rebel starfighters, and the Emperor, in an attempt to defend the capital, stood outside the Senate building and raised his hands, and fired a huge burst of electricity into the skies of Coruscant. Thanks to these being droid pilots, most of them at least, their entire systems shut down. The pilots of Blue Squadron were able to signal distress before their comms were blasted. Sidious laughed to himself, as every single fighter slowly fell out of the sky. The Sith Lord would stop these rebel insurgents himself. The light show of lightning was incredible to see, but it was nothing compared to the red, blue, and green blasts that sped through the atmosphere. Inside of Rebel 1, the automated crew detected an energy surge on the planet. Due to being above the atmosphere, they rained hell down on the Senate building, crushing through the structural support and destroying Palpatine in a multitude of explosions. He wasn't able to redirect his focus because they came so fast. The explosions rocked him, killed him, and then sent him into the cold grip of death, not to return again. The rebel flagship, though, would not survive the rest of the fight. 3 more fleets from surrounding core systems would engage at Coruscant. Their interdictors would trap the rebels at Coruscant, until the remaining squad of the Swarm kamikazed into the interdictors, freeing up the survivors of Blue Squadron and the Ghost who abandoned the planet. While losing Rebel 1 was a heartfelt loss for the Alliance, they had truly won the battle. Those 3 other system fleets would almost entirely be destroyed before Rebel 1 went down. If it weren't for the TIE Defender beamers, it would have been a total loss for the Empire, with Rebel 1 surviving everything. But still, out of over 100 Star Destroyers present at the Battle of Coruscant, only 3 survived, with a handful of support craft and maybe 80 or so TIE Defenders. It was a horrendous loss, and the rebels had to reconsider how they might move forward without Rebel 1 and around 50,000 fighters. Luckily for them, though, they had the benefit of new allies, willing to support them by bringing forward a new fleet, equipped with Mon Calamari cruisers, but there remained an issue still. In any other circumstance, the rebels would have been favorable because they were the underdogs, but they just beat up on the Empire without remorse. They didn't show any sort of mercy either. They came off as oppressive as the Empire, which in all honesty is really bizarre. The Empire had such a great victim complex because they were still the powerhouse government in the galaxy, and people were worried because the poor little Empire got hurt? Like what? Why? It's because the rebels showed some fight, and they brought it to the overcompetent dimwits that controlled the Imperial machine following Thrawn's death. Thrawn was the first Grand Admiral to go, but now none survived, and the few Imperials with power weren't all that confident. No one won anything. It was just a big, awkward silence that followed Coruscant. People weren't especially thrilled about Palpatine's death. Luckily, most of the Senate wasn't inside the Senate building when the attack happened, but still, it wasn't a great look for the rebels, and they couldn't do anything but wait, which they could actually afford. Leia made the point especially clear. They weren't trying to win a popularity contest, and they kind of were, but her point was that they were trying to erase the Emperor's rule, return the government to an actual democracy, to a real republic. They couldn't do that with Palpatine. He was gone now, so they should focus on providing relief, destroying super weapons and Star Destroyers, while also helping rebuild the people where the Empire neglected to. This did mean that the whole Jin and Luke propaganda story stopped, but they were able to continue their own little thing. They luckily had some sort of chemistry, meaning that while Luke started his Jedi training, he'd be very distracted. His father, Vader, was chained down without a suit, instead of a bacta tank. He wasn't permitted to leave, and they pretty much kept him there. They didn't mean to, but after a couple months of him killing medics and troopers, he'd starve to death, and die floating aimlessly without purpose. His refusal to change, believing that Luke would join the dark side, is what killed him. The power to alter his life sat within his hands, and he didn't do anything to fix it. The rebel leaders would buy into Leia's ideas, and use the Star Forge to craft more warships, but they also spent a lot of energy on creating a supply fleet, which would be used across the stars to help millions, if not billions, of people. The Senate with power was now able to redirect the budget into the people. The rebels, though, were already a step ahead of the Senate, by directly waving their banners and assisting people. If stormtroopers fought back, they'd be killed out of self-defense. It would take years for the people of the galaxy to truly value the Alliance and not see them as warmongers, which they never were. But the rebels were fine with that. The Imperial Senate was no better than the Emperor-led one, and it would need to be replaced. Though what became an incredibly important part about this route is that by elongating time for the Imperial Senate to breathe without Palpatine, the people knew which senators to weed out. Individuals like Hamata Ziono from Hosnian Prime were among many senators who would need to be removed from governmental positions once the New Republic took over. There were, of course, dozens and dozens of skirmishes over the years, but the Battle of Coruscant was truly the last battle between the rebels and the Empire. It was a true turning point in the war. The rebels had a military, and the Imperial one slowly faded away, because everyone who joined it knew that service was a death sentence. Over the years, that led to the rise of the New Republic. There were some notable changes. Hera and Kanan became the only couple in Star Wars ever to not have a tragic ending by having Jason together and not being burnt to death on Lothal. Luke and Jin would catch the hots for each other, which would irritate old Ben Kenobi, because he let Satine die for a moral high ground over a wannabe Sith. This attachment to Jin would lead to the New Jedi Order rejecting old values and moving into the future, alongside the New Republic, with a new outlook. Ezra and Kanan were incredibly helpful for forming this, because their Boken lifestyle up close to Luke was a lot more appealing than the hermit lifestyle of Kenobi and Yoda, one without emotion or feeling or acting like a robot. The Jedi Order would forever be changed. As for Ezra, he and Leia would get hitched just a few months after Coruscant. The Senator and Jabba the Hutt were a fantastic pairing, and they endlessly made each other happy. If you know, you know. The New Republic would stand strong. The Star Forge would remain in control of trusted generals and admirals. It started with Syndulla and Akbar, before eventually getting passed on to Commander Dameron of the New Republic Navy. These influential people would continue passing the torch to truly righteous loyalists of the Republic. The system itself would flourish for years, remaining a powerhouse in the galaxy, long past the age of Vong. and the attempts made by the dying out crime families. The Star Forge remained an anchor for the Republic, as it continuously provided relief for the people of the galaxy for centuries to come. And that, my friends, is our story. Again, special thanks to the patrons: Benjamin Wells, Ozpin, Angel Dust, Jack Silver, There Are Cars, The Shade of Fear, Prismatic Warlock Master, Lyndall Asher, Schmoogs, Darth Vitiate, Seju Jagger, Groot 36, Hunter Belden, Rosebird, General Alexander, Robin Roberts, Blackie Chan, Alexander Arista Beginning and End, Django Fat Clone, Nick 5098, Ben Ingram, The Big Red Pyramark, Diamond Constant, Darth Nemesis, Lord Tibbs, CC2024, Galvin Gaming, Tristan, Mandalore, Sir Wellen 1767, Darth Revan, Granddaddy Bane, Laliant, Sky Guy, Penguin, Cullen Rooney, Shark Midori, RJ38, Nick, Michael Erlanger, The Last Jedi, Apollo, Weewoo 670, Annika Stank Runner, CT7567, Toaster Oven, Oz of Oz, Darth Knox, The Eternal Padawan, Joshua Tem, Jenny Naguin, Sansa Skeleton, Mr. Yeet Gamer, Lord Calig, Youngling Slayer 66, Mad Meta Studios, Anakin 003, Lord Draken, Fortis Legacy Star Wars, Airbus, Rex the Wolf, the main three first names, Dark Saint 46, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing. For supporting the channel, smash that like button. Let's talk about this story. So one big thing I want to get out of the way is that I think the Alliance, by using the Swarm, could actually really take away positive reinforcement from themselves. The Alliance in the canon timeline is really popular because they're the underdogs. Everyone loves an underdog. But if the Rebels started clobbering Imperial fleets without any struggle whatsoever, they probably wouldn't be underdogs. So this story is kind of putting them into a position where they can actually destroy the Empire. This story was a little bit of a mix of both, having character focus and also wide story focus. I thought Leia and Ezra, I've done it before, but I think they're a great match. Having Luke and Jin, I've seen that in the comments a bunch of times, and I got you guys. I finally got that into a story, so I hope you guys appreciate that. And then having Kanan and Hera survive, that's pretty cool. I like that as well. But having Leia being the big rebel in the story, I think is what is really the most important part about it. I think the Alliance leaders kind of had a lot of attributes of the Old Republic Senate, and I think that really hurt them because they were trying to go into a new era and they were kind of going about it the wrong way. It's partially why Mon Mothma demilitarizes, because the Republic of Old was demilitarized before the Clone Wars. It's just kind of an old way that doesn't really work for the current time, and that's why Leia is kind of the anchor of the story. She's the rebel that kind of pushes things to come to fruition. So I really hope you enjoy this really long story with the Star Forge. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.